testing it, demonstrating it, proving it, and so on. The principle is enshrined in the first law of thermodynamics, and you could say it's implicit in virtually every other sequence of scientific laws from Newton's laws on. So it is very much probably the most fundamental scientific law we have. I did a presentation like this once where I said, if you're right, the planes wouldn't fly. Oh my God, you know, I'm never flying again. But it shows you how enshrined, and it is deeply embedded in all scientific law. So if you're going to make a claim against something, it's probably the most difficult one to claim against. It's an interesting history, because when you begin to doubt it, which we did several years ago, obviously you start to look at it slightly deeper, and this gentleman, Thales, is credited with being the first person to give some kind of an implicit definition of conservation of energy. And what Thales said is that, and he was a philosopher, he wasn't a scientist like that, he was a engineer back then, he was a philosopher. He said, look, there is some substance in the universe that must be conserved. Now, in his world it was water, but it could be anything. But it demonstrates, we're talking, 500-600 years before Christ. So this is a concept that has been there an awful lot longer than the laws of thermodynamics. Galileo himself was the first person to look at his classic pendulum experiment, where he demonstrated the conversion of potential energy into kinetic energy, not in the terms that are expressed here, but these are the terms that we do it now. And again, this is all part of the process of science and humanity coming to grips with conservation of energy. Mr. Leibniz took Galileo's experiments and expressed them mathematically. And again, these are defining moments in conservation of energy. And what he did is he came up with this principle called the conservation of momentum. That momentum must be conserved in any system. Again, you can check all this, but it just demonstrates there's a long history here of every indication that we have within science and with humanity is the conservation of some property. To continue, after the conservation of momentum, a lot of engineers, God bless them, started to look at this. But hang on, you can't really conserve momentum, because if I spin a wheel, it isn't conserved, it's slowing down. And obviously we know that it's shedding energy, kinetic energy, to heat and air resistance, and so on. However, they needed to find a more broader definition to be able to understand this and explain this. And in fact, fundamental to the whole of conservation of energy is energy, because we're talking about conserving the quantity and the quantity of energy. And I guess the term energy was first used in modern science by Thomas Young, not that long ago. But how we would understand energy in the modern world was first used by Thomas Young. And the first explicit statement, again, there's an awful lot of names that will fly around, but if you kind of do the research, you find this guy, Karl Moore, was probably the first guy to express in words or in publishing what we understand, or the basic principles of what we understand today. The conservation of energy derives from the conservation of momentum, derives from the conservation of some principle or something along some lines. So this is not only very fundamental to science, it has huge pedigree in terms of the people who've worked in it, the people who've evolved it, and so on and so on. But the story isn't quite honest when it comes to conservation of energy, because Mr. Einstein, in his paper, which I still think is one of the great thought leaps of humanity, came up with the classic equation equals mc squared, where E is obviously energy, m is mass, and c squared is c divided by squared. And nothing remarkable about that, except a very short-lived, and I mean very short-lived thing, because if you look at the equation purely mathematically and say, okay, if I destroy n mass, or reduce the amount of mass, energy must increase. Therefore, I create energy. Basic mathematics. Of course, this is not how we understand it. How we understand it is the concept of energy-mass equivalence. In that mass and energy are equivalent, they're in fact the same thing. So we look at things like this that you could take in a very simple way, so by reducing one quantity you increase the other. And so that actually again nicely ties in with conservation of energy. An interesting thing as well, if you ever begin to doubt this, and maybe you will, maybe you won't, is that if you look at the statement, energy can either be created or destroyed, it has the feeling of being a commandment. It is thou shalt not. And maybe this is just around personal experience, because as soon as you stand up and say, well, excuse me sir, I don't think that's quite right, the response tends to be quite religious. But also it's not a very math-heavy area. If you go into thermodynamics is hugely math-heavy. But in essence, all that the math says is delta energy over delta time is equal to zero in the plus system. You know. But it's a principle derived phenomenologically, by test, by experience, and so on. And again, never credibly disproven. But if you really get into this, which we do, and I don't know if this is taught in any of the colleges, but it's certainly taught in most science classes, that there is a very rigorous mathematical test for conservation of energy. And it's called Nairobi's theorem. And Nairobi's theorem was a German mathematician from a long line of family of mathematicians in 1915. And it is the defining moment in conservation of energy, because it defines the logic and the beautiful symmetry of conservation of energy. If you're into the area, I really suggest you look at it. However, it's bloody complex. It is not a simple piece of work. It is a mathematical expression, definition of the logic required for conservation of energy as a whole. And in essence, and I'm putting this in perhaps too simplistic terms, but what Nairobi's theorem derives at the end of all the mathematics, it says that for conservation of energy as a whole, laws of nature and energy itself and energy transactions must be invariant in time. And it's actually quite easy to understand at one level. Invariant in time says that if I lift that phone a metre and I put a certain amount of work doing that, and I put it down a metre, idealise the situation, the net energy is zero. Now, if I lifted it up and held it there for a minute and the laws of nature changed, and I put it down, the energies wouldn't sum to zero. So it's a prerequisite, obviously, that the laws of nature don't understand. Also, if I lifted the phone a metre and I did it in 1 second, and the amount of energy involved if I did it in 2 seconds was different, when I put it back down again, energy wouldn't be conserved. So, in essence, Nairobi's theorem is the pure logic and the pure mathematics of conservation of energy. And is, to date, the defining work. The theorem itself, while it's not that well known, is the foundation tool for modern theoretical physics. And turned out to us, once we began to read it and go, this math is a bit heavy, incredibly important to us in understanding this bizarre magnetic effect that we discovered that's now Somebody said to me recently, you know, well, there's been a lot of wackos like yourself making claims about conservation of energy. Is there any credible evidence that conservation of energy isn't real? So, and again, maybe this is something, a process you can only go through once you begin to have doubts about something. And I guess the first thing to understand is how do we define what a scientific law or a physical law, depending on what term we want to use, is. A physical law remains valid until disproven. And that's simply fact. There have been lots of physical laws that have been disproven and then modified and so on. Also, physical law has to be universal. And again, this is kind of like Nairobi's theorem. It has to exist and be contiguous through time and through space. So you can't have one physical law here on Earth and a different physical law on the Moon. They have to be. And these are the definitions of the law, of what a law is. So when you look at conservation of energy, you go, hang on a minute, other than, you know, crazy companies like ours and mad people with, you know, tin pots on their heads in their back garden claiming that they've, you know, built perpetual motion machines, so you exclude, you know, the fringe elements. How true is it? Is there any credible third-party explanation that would even lead to question whether or not conservation of energy is true? Because, like, probably a lot of the engineers here have spent an awful lot of time proving up to several years ago in my daily work and through college. And the answer is, strangely enough, maybe. If you look at the hunt for the graviton, and this is not a lecture about the graviton, we're just discuss the results of some experiments. The hunt for the graviton, what is the graviton? Graviton is this hypothetical particle that provides gravity. And the way that we seek such particles